Hello and welcome. My name is Ciance, and today we will be breaking down and discussing the pilot episode of my favorite show of all time, Sex and the City. So, like I said, welcome. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ciance, and Say for short, hence the name of the channel. I am a queer, non binary Chicano. But more importantly, I am a Sex and the City superfan. I have rewatched the entire series more times than I can even recall. And I've rewatched favorite seasons and episodes hundreds of times. And we'll go into like more details eventually about which seasons those are, which episodes those are. But for instance, is I watch the first episode of season 4 every year on my birthday. As a matter of fact, one of my best friends actually got me a headband that matches the one Carrie wore to Il Cantonori for my birthday a few years ago. Now, I wasn't old or lucky enough to watch the show when it was originally airing. I watched it for the first time via Netflix, but not Netflix when it was streaming. It was all mail order DVDs. And eventually, I got so frustrated by, if you know how the season 1 DVDs specifically are put together, the uh, people put 4 to 6 episodes on a single disc, and season 1 has 2 discs. And actually, here it is. When I first started watching it, I was getting 3 discs at a time. So I got season 1 and then the first disc of season 2. And then I had to return them, wait a few days to get the rest of the discs, and it was like so annoying. So eventually I got all of the DVDs, and like I said, here is the season 1 complete first season with the DVDs. And so like I said, right, it's 2 discs. And the reason that I got all of the DVDs and why I'm so excited that I did is because the commentary also starts in the 3rd season. And so I've watched all of the commentary on top of watching all of the episodes over and over again. I have the book. I reread the book recently, and that is actually what inspired me to make this channel. I do also have the Kiss and Tell book that has a lot of like behind the scenes information, a lot of stories from the different cast members and their reactions to the series itself. So I'm excited to be able to dive into this and put all of that knowledge and research that I've put together down for each of the different episodes. I also watched the E True Hollywood Story, but honestly, it's not very relevant to what I'm going to be doing here. So I'll mention it, I think, once for this episode. And then really after that, it's like, oh, okay. Now, let's start talking about Sex and the City. So Sex and the City, the TV show, premiered on June 6th, 1998. It was based on the book Sex and the City by Candace Bushnell. And the book itself was actually a collection of her columns that she originally wrote for the New York Observer. And we're going to talk about the book a lot throughout, specifically this first season. But it's important to acknowledge right off the bat that many quotes and situations throughout at least the first part of season 1 come directly from the book. Now, obviously, I'll point out as many of those instances as I have caught through my rereading of the book. But even if I miss some or I may misinterpret some situations that weren't actually inspired by stories in the book. It's okay, right? We're all about having fun here. Now, the reason that I even bring this up is because the show really is based on the book. It's fairly rare that the situations for dialogue are literally picked up from the book, or even that the same character says a specific line. And you'll see what I mean as we really get going. But I did just want to point that out right from the beginning. Also, we are just going to dive right into the pilot episode and not talk a lot about the historical significance of the show or like the production of it or anything like that. I want to save that for a season 1 retrospective that I'll record after I recap all of the season 1 episodes. And really, what I want the retrospectives to be for are for, talking about the impact of each season and just the show in general. And then also including other random thoughts that I've had throughout filming that didn't make it into individual episode breakdowns. I also want to talk about a lot of discussion around the show, specifically like scholarly insights into the show. Now, as a Sex and the City superfan, I obviously love this show, which means that I am going to treat it like other things that I love. Because I'm a Catholic, I am going to be honest about my feelings throughout the series. So that means I'm not going to shy away from calling out the many things that do need to be called out, whether that's by erasure, casual racism, transphobia, privilege, sexism, what have you. So unlike probably some people who fell in love with the show either during or around the time it's aired, I'm not going to apologize for the things that make the show and its characters hard to love at times. Now, revisiting the show for this channel has convinced me to eventually continue past the original series in order to break down and discuss the 2 movies and the new series, and just like that. And as we'll definitely talk about, a lot of what I am going to critique will come up in the new series specifically. And I want to be able to establish a baseline for how I'm going to break down and react to those things. Okay. So before we begin, I do want to paint a little bit of a picture of the cultural landscape that existed in 1998 and into which Sex and the City entered. I'm not going to talk a lot about the television landscape specifically right now, because I want to save a lot of that for the retrospective. But there are just a few interesting tidbits about 1997, the year that Sex and the City was filmed, and then 1998, the year that Sex and the City premiered. Now, in 1997, Google launched, Netflix launched, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published, Princess Diana died, and Titanic was the first movie to gross over $1 billion. Now, in 1998, in March, the FDA approved Viagra, and it hit the market shortly after that. The first Apple iMac, the iMac G3, was introduced in August. And probably most significantly, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal was in full force, including the infamous "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky" statement on January 26th. But finally, the world was introduced to Sex and the City on Sunday, June 6th, 1998. Now we start with the opening credits, which include the now iconic Sex and the City theme, which was composed by Douglas Cuomo. who had done some scores for various networks and independent films before this, but he's really done a lot of scores for documentaries. And he's since then he's done a lot of interesting things in classical music and opera. Now, according to show creator Darren Star, who we're going to talk about here shortly, he wanted a Latin cocktail themed vibe. And luckily, he loved the song the second he heard it. And honestly, I feel so emotionally attached to the theme that I can't even like talk about it with any objectivity. So I agree with Darren Star that it is just very, very infectious. Anyway, once the theme starts, we have a quick shot of Carrie's forehead. We see HBO Presents in the sky next to the Chrysler Building. We see Carrie smiling, her big, beautiful smile. And then the title swoops in under the Brooklyn Bridge and next to the Twin Towers, which I'm not going to get into a lot right now. But this is just a reminder that seasons 1 through 4 were filmed pre 9/11. Now, I'm going to skip the Carrie aspect of the opening credits until episode 6. And I'm really not going to talk about the credits again until then. And then we'll come back to this skyline again in season 4. But before we even talk about the rest of the credits, I need to be controversial yet brave for a moment and admit that I hate this font. Don't get me wrong. I can't imagine the opening credits or the rest of the show without this font, especially like that title card for each episode. But, you know, as a branding expert who has looked at hundreds, if not thousands of fonts, I really can't with this. I could totally rant about this font for like too long, but I'm not going to do that. What I will say though is that this is actually like not even close to my least favorite 90s television font. Like I think about like Caroline in the City or like the Friends font or like My So-Called Life. I could go on and on here, but I digress. But basically, fonts were not living their best lives in the 90s. But let's move on. So like I said, I'm going to talk about Carrie's little mini journey here during the episode 6 breakdown, but we get a nice little tour of the city as we get the main cast names. So Sarah Jessica Parker is also presented next to the World Trade Center. Kim Cattrall's name shows up as we weave through countless yellow taxis. Now, I am not a New Yorker, so I have to rely on things like commentary and the books for specific references, but I feel like we're traveling along Fifth Avenue during this section. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments. Now, Kristen Davis is presented with the Brooklyn Bridge. And then Cynthia Nixon's name scales the Chrysler Building, kind of wrapping up our tour where it began. Now, the more I've thought about the credits, the more I've dissected the reason that each location was chosen for each actor. I think I'll do like a whole separate video for that at some point because my mind starts racing whenever I really start to think about it. But suffice to say, I feel like the Twin Towers were used for Sarah Jessica Parker because Carrie is really the central grounding character for the audience. And really, other than like the Statue of Liberty, there wasn't any more defining silhouette of Manhattan than the World Trade Center towers. Now, Samantha is the fastest of the characters. We'll leave that there for now. And then I feel like there's just like regality and dignity to Charlotte, which is why the Brooklyn Bridge works so well. And then really Miranda is like the brains of the group, right? Which is why we zoom in on the crown of the Chrysler building. Now, that is the very abridged version of my feelings about the specific imagery and locations chosen for each actor's name. Now, like I said, I'll come back to Carrie's shenanigans during the episode 6 breakdown, but we do close the credits with created by Darren Star in the aftermath of said shenanigans. So let's chat a little bit about Darren Star. By 1997, which is when they filmed the pilot episode, Darren Star had already created Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place. His next drama, Central Park West, seems like it was just as dramatic as its predecessors, but it took place in New York City. Now, CPW, as it was also called, didn't last very long, but it did give Star an excuse to get out to New York. And apparently, Star quickly became a fan of Bushnell's column. And then she interviewed him for a magazine article, and they became friends. Bushnell took him to Bowery Bar, which shows up everywhere in the book. Unfortunately, it does not show up in the series, and it's closed now, also, unfortunately. But at Bowery Bar, he said, Carolyn Bessette was at our table. David Blaine was doing card tricks, and it was a down the rabbit hole kind of feeling. I thought these people are a million times more interesting than any of the people I'm writing about on Central Park West. That's when I began to think that I wasn't capturing the real New York in the show I was doing, and that I wanted to create a show that did. And like I said, I'll talk more about the production and everything leading up to the airing of the pilot and the series itself in the retrospective. But one interesting tidbit, Star didn't really decide on following this core group of friends until the book was published in 1996. Now, a few character names were taken from the book, and then the rest is really history. One thing I'll be focusing on a lot during this first season is that the names, but not the actual characters, are taken from the book. But anyway, this episode was directed by Susan Seidelman, who had previously directed Desperately Seeking Susan and one of my favorites, the absolutely ridiculous She-Devil. And then in 1994, she was actually nominated for an Academy Award for Best Live Action Short Film for The Dutch Master. And then this episode was written by Darren Star. Now, we begin the episode with the story of Elizabeth and her ill-fated 2-week romance with a man after she arrives in New York. Now, while the show starts once upon a time, the book begins, here's a Valentine's Day tale. Prepare yourself. A bit dramatic, right? But it instantly gives us the tone of the entire book, which is a lot more cynical than the series. And that's already evident by the title of the first chapter, My Unsentimental Education, Love in Manhattan. I don't think so. Anyway, after that, the book and the show let us know that an English journalist came to New York. And this is where we meet Elizabeth, played by Australian actor Sarah Winter, who is probably best known for playing Kate Warner on the TV show 24. Now, Elizabeth enters the city via the Manhattan Bridge, looking so hopeful, surrounded by her Louis Vuitton luggage, and wearing an ugly fucking hat. Now, the costume designer for this episode is not Pat Fields. It's actually Ellen Lutter, who did the costumes for the movies 54 and 28 Days. But she also did the costumes for a lot of Adam Sandler movies. So do what you will with that information. We then meet 42-year-old Tim, played by native New Yorker Scott Bryce, who was on a few very 90s TV shows like Murphy Brown and LA Law, but is most notable for his role as Craig Montgomery on As the World Turns, which also starred a pre-Top Gun Meg Ryan. Now, quite a few details of this story are changed from the book to the series. For instance, in the book, Tim makes $5 million a year instead of two, which I guess makes him more relatable. The book also doesn't say anything about him being well liked or respected, and we have no idea how they met. Which, speaking of how they met, I do want to take a second to point out that the paintings behind them are Whistler and Francis by English artist Gary Hume, which means this meet cute was very likely shot at the Matthew Marks Gallery on West 22nd Street. Now, another thing that I find interesting about this scene is that most of the extras are dressed in dark clothing, which is very typical for a gallery opening. But like Tim is wearing beige, which, why is he there dressed in beige? Elizabeth looks great in this red cocktail dress, much more appropriate, but still kind of out of place. Which is kind of nice for us visually, right? It tells us exactly who we should be looking at with this huge crowd of people. And it's also probably why they gravitated toward each other. So we now see the happy couple doing gross coupley straight white people things, like whatever this is, this sports balling on a river, and drinking white wine at dinner in a fancy restaurant while playing footsie, and then having very vanilla sex, which obviously I can't show, but it's described as wonderful. And I'm like, okay. Now, while the 2-week timeline is the same in both the book and the series, in the book, we don't get any of these details. Like, we don't get any indication of how he actually treats her during this time. Now, all of a sudden, they're going house shopping. In the book, they go to the Hamptons to see a house that Tim is already building instead of a townhouse. But this thought of children is apparent in both of them. So Tim says not yet when asked if they have children. And in the book, she says, I wanted to tell the architect to fill in the railings on the second floor so the children wouldn't fall through. Like, what? Is that a thing that people, does that happen? I mean, if anything, I'd be like, make the railings safer for the nanny. I feel like we're expecting the omen to happen. Anyway, immediately after this in the book, she says, I expected Tim was going to ask me to marry him. Like, okay. But in the show, after the viewing, Tim pops the question by asking Elizabeth to have dinner with his parents on Tuesday night. In the book, though, he reminds her, so they go and see the house on a Sunday, and he reminds her of dinner plans on Tuesday. But in both the book and the series, he calls on Tuesday to say that he has to take a rain check. Now, in the book, he has no excuse, but in both, after 2 weeks, she calls and says, that's an awfully long rain check, and he says that he would call later. But he never did call, of course. Now, after this, Elizabeth explains that in England, meeting the parents, or in the book, the architect, would have meant something. Which brings us to this quote from Carrie / Candace. No one told her about the end of love in Manhattan. And then here, Carrie puts out her cigarette in a very well-used ashtray. Like, how long was this story? Did she just chain smoke all of those during this story? Like, Damn, girl. Okay. But in the book, we get the line, "Then I thought she'll learn." Now, the subtle differences between the book and this opening story really highlight the approach that Darren Star is going to take throughout the series. We watch as Elizabeth goes from hopeful to blissful and then jaded by this early dating experience in Manhattan. Whereas in the book, Candace is much more detached and seems almost judgmental of the journalist's naivete. When Carrie hears this story, she's not shocked, but she does stub out her cigarette. Like, she's so sick of hearing these stories about men being bastards. Now, Candace Bushnell did freelance as a journalist for a number of years before she started writing Sex and the City. So this objective approach kind of makes sense, right? She's writing down her observations and then providing some commentary. So for Bushnell, the story of the English journalist is just context for this commentary and her unsentimental education about this end of love. For Star in the series, though, we need to go through the same emotional journey as Elizabeth so that we can also feel jaded and understand what Carrie is going to tell us about the lack of love in not only her life, but also the lives of the friends we're about to meet. Also, a fun fact, in the book, the English journalist is actually Charlotte, which is the first of many that character is actually this character in the book moments. Now, with some amazing saxophone accompaniment, we pan up to Carrie's apartment window, which looks over a very stereotypical New York street, right? We have a police car parked on the street, a bunch of cabs driving by, and apparently Carrie lives above an antique shop and a coffee shop, I'm hoping, because that's a giant ass neon coffee sign. Um, and this will change, but like this damn neon sign is just like one of those like nudges, right? Like, hey, no, really, she does live in New York kind of things. Like I'm thinking of Fame when the gay character is like singing and we see like the flashing light. Anyway, with a few omitted lines, we get a monologue pulled directly from the book. Welcome to the age of uninnocence. No one has breakfast at Tiffany's and no one has affairs to remember. Instead, we have breakfast at 7 a.m. and affairs we try to forget as quickly as possible. Self-protection and closing the deal are paramount. Cupid has flown the co-op. How did we get into this mess? Which Carrie adds a "the hell" for good measure. Now, this line about self-protection and closing the deal has more context in the book, where Bushnell talks about the 90s dilemma of love versus the deal, and how Truman Capote's Breakfast at Tiffany's characters, Holly Golightly and Paul Varjak, overcome their restrictions as kept people by choosing love over money. But she then tells us that that doesn't happen in Manhattan any longer. Everyone is a kept person by way of jobs, apartments, the Hamptons beachfront, and front row tickets at the Garden, and how they prefer it that way. Bushnell writes, there's still plenty of sex in Manhattan, but the kind of sex that results in friendship and business deals, not romance. These days, everyone has friends and colleagues. No one really has a lover, even if they have slept together, which is like the most 90s New York thing ever, right? Again, cynical, direct, just like this very New York, which is why it doesn't at all surprise me that her column was so popular among New Yorkers. And this still works well in the book because it has that very like Jacqueline Suzanne, Jackie Collins feel to it, right? As a reader, we love the tantalizing and salacious stories of people we don't know, which is why Star takes a different approach for the show. And I'll talk more about that later. So let's move on. So from here, we're going to jump around the book a bit, starting with chapter 4, Manhattan Wedlock, Never Married Women, Toxic Bachelors. So as we get a shot of a bunch of women walking along a Manhattan sidewalk, it almost feels like an homage to the classic 1939 film, The Women, which is about a group of socialites in New York. And the movie itself doesn't have a single male in the entire film, even though like literally all they talk about is men. Anyway, we have this shot and then zoom in on Carrie as she tells us about the maybe tens of thousands of women like this in the city who we all know and agree are great. They travel, they pay taxes, they'll spend $400 on a pair of Manolo Blahnik strappy sandals. Again, we have some different context for this in the book, where Bushnell talks about the women who are able to marry whenever they want because they're beautiful and successful and rich and know everyone, versus women in their late 30s or early 40s who will never marry. What if, on the other hand, you're 40 and pretty and you're a television producer or have your own PR company, but you still live in a studio and sleep on a fold-out couch, the 90s equivalent of Mary Tyler Moore. Except, unlike Mary Tyler Moore, you've actually gone to bed with all those guys instead of demurely kicking them out at 12:02 a.m. What happened to those women? Now, in the show, Carrie tells us that all of these New York women, right, 20s, 30s, 40s, everything, they're alone. Now, finally, we get to see Carrie a bit more out and about by herself. And let's talk about Carrie a bit. So she's portrayed by the amazing Sarah Jessica Parker, who first appeared on television all the way back in 1982 on the sitcom Square Pegs when she was just 17 years old. She then did the movies Footloose and Girls Just Want to Have Fun, and never really returned to television until she reluctantly accepted the role of Carrie Bradshaw. Now, she was the only person Darren Star wanted to play the role, and his choice really does demonstrate what I keep saying about his chosen direction for the show compared to the book. He said, if you have an emotional character who has sex freely, is independent, and talks about sex, you have to find an actress who can make that character sympathetic. I felt Sarah Jessica Parker would bring a sense of romanticism and humanity to the character. I needed the combination of her and the role. Now, like I said, Bushnell didn't care about sympathy for herself or any of the characters in the book. But this is television. If all of the characters in the show were as unlikable as they truly are in the book, we wouldn't have stuck around for 6 seasons, 2 movies, and a spin-off series. But we'll talk about more of all of that as we go. Now, the character of Carrie Bradshaw was created to be a stand-in for Candace Bushnell as she continued to write the column and get herself into more and more precarious situations. She wrote on her website that she created Carrie because she didn't want her parents to know that she'd just been to a sex club, which, like, in that chapter, she uses first-person narration, but anyway. Now, Carrie grabs a copy of the New York Star, which is the fictional replacement for the New York Observer that Bushnell wrote for. Now, while she does this, she once again speaks directly to the camera as she asks, why are there so many great unmarried women and no great unmarried men? And as she opens up the paper, there's a great little visual gag with this giant headline, Why? No One Knows, right on the front. Now, the cover of the New York Star pretty closely resembles the cover of the New York Observer, or at least the masthead does. And we then get a glimpse at the column itself in the paper with a nice little headshot of Carrie. The text here is the exact story and monologue we just heard, which kind of breaks my brain. almost as much as my problem with Carrie's fourth wall breaking, but I'll talk about that soon. But the funny thing is, we zoom to the headline of the column, which should sound familiar: Unmarried Women, Toxic Bachelors. And we see that the text is just repeated after the unmarried guys question. Anyway, Carrie explains that her column explores these kinds of questions and that she has amazing sources, her friends. But then we jump to Peter Mason, played by Bruce McCarty, who also showed up in a lot of very 90s shows like Ally McBeal, but nothing really noteworthy. Now, Peter is obviously, or at least hopefully, not Carrie's friend. He's disgusting, and I feel so bad for Carrie to have to go and talk to this sleazy, sweaty man. Anyway, he talks about the mid-30s power flip, where the power in a relationship flips to the guy seemingly overnight. Now, in the book, this is said by a man named Roger, who's 39, rich, and lives on Park Avenue in a classic 6 apartment. So Roger said he had gone to a cocktail party earlier in the evening, and when he walked in, there were 7 single women in their mid to late 30s, all Upper East Side blonde, wearing black cocktail dresses, and one wittier than the next. You know that there's nothing you can say that's wrong, Roger said. For women, it's desperation combined with reaching their sexual peak. It's a very volatile combination. You see that look in their eyes. Possession at any cost mixed with a healthy respect for cash flow. And you feel like they're going to Lexus and Nexus you as soon as you leave the room. The worst thing is, most of these women are really interesting because they didn't just go and get married. But when a man sees that look in their eyes, how can you feel passionate? So Peter gets a little name tag, identifying him as an advertising executive and toxic bachelor, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this goddamn smirk makes me want to reach into the screen and just slap him. Anyway, we move on to Capote Duncan, played by Jeffrey Nordling, who is best known for his role as Gordon Klein in Big Little Lies. Now, Capote Duncan is based on a character in the book who is actually Jay McInerney, the author of Bright Lights, Big City, which is hilarious because in season 3, episode 16, Carrie's seminar at the Learning Annex is called Bright Lights, State City. Anyway, Bushnell disguised a lot of well-known Page 6 regulars with these pseudonyms. As one article put it, Bushnell was not disguising who her friends were. In her column, in fact, she was doing the opposite. She was very nearly name-dropping. It was more like name teasing, and all her fans loved to play along. Now, Capote Duncan here combines dialogue from 2 different people in the book about marriage really being only about having kids, something that we'll get into in episode 10. And also how marrying an older woman means that you'll have to have kids immediately. And he says, and that's about it. Now, in the book, George, who says this, actually means that a marriage becomes just about the kids when you marry an older woman. But either way, the sentiment is so antiquated and pseudoscientific. Obviously a publishing executive is going to blame his toxic behaviors on biology. Speaking of, this idea of a toxic bachelor is actually very different in the book. In the book, a toxic bachelor isn't toxic because he's a disgusting human being. Instead, it's a term to describe a group of well-known bachelors at the time, like Mort Zuckerman or Marvin, who's described as a publisher, which makes me think it's actually Mr. Big, which we'll get to soon. But basically, these bachelors sully a woman's reputation once she's dated them. So men don't want to have a relationship, let alone marriage, with the women who've dated these toxic bachelors. In the show, toxic bachelors are men. They're men. They're skeezy, they're sleazy, they give us the very low bar for which to measure the other men we meet throughout the series. But this brings us to Miranda, played by Cynthia Nixon, who I wouldn't say was that well known for her television or movie roles up until this role. But she was very well known on Broadway, and she's another native New Yorker. Now, Miranda tells us a story that's told to Bushnell by Peter in the book. It's a tragic story about a 41-year-old woman who always went out with extremely sexy guys and just had a good time. But she wakes up one day and can't get any more dates. She has a complete physical breakdown, couldn't keep her job, and had to move back home with her mother. Now, Miranda says, "Trust me, this is not a story that makes men feel bad." In the book, Bushnell has to tell us this because Peter is telling this story to support his argument that unmarried older women are in denial about the torment they have about not being married. So once again, that tonal shift from objective New York observer, you're welcome, to a subjective audience that agrees with what the women are saying, right? And then we get to Charlotte. Now, Charlotte is played to perfection by Kristen Davis, who was previously on Melrose Place, so she and Darren Star already knew each other. Now, Davis was born in Colorado, like moi, but she grew up in South Carolina. Now, let's be honest, I'm going to talk a lot of shit about Charlotte throughout the series, but I do think that she actually had the most growth between this line and the final seasons. Now, Charlotte is an art dealer in this episode, but I feel like her job switched to curator after this, but we'll talk about her gallery and stuff a lot later. Now, she says something that is kind of a reworking of something from the book that's spoken by Sarah, an independent film director. Charlotte says that men are threatened by successful women, and the way to get a guy is to keep your mouth shut and play by the rules. Ugh. In the book, Sarah says, this idea of women not being able to get married, it's so small-minded. I can't even deal with it. If you want to get these guys, you have to shut up. You have to sit there and shut up and agree with everything they say. So to Charlotte, shutting up is a good thing. But Sarah is like, no, fuck that noise. Now, from Charlotte, we meet Skipper Johnston, which is Johnson in the book. But Skipper is played by Ben Weber, who really wasn't in a lot of roles before or since this one. He played a non-speaking character in Twister as one of Jonas's little lackeys. But he also played a really sad 6 out of 10 on a good day character named Patrick in the gay rom-com The Broken Hearts Club, which also starred Timothy Olyphant and Justin Theroux. It was also probably the first movie I watched that was all gay characters, even though only like 2 of the actors in the cast were actually gay. Don't get me started. Now, in the book, Skipper is a wildly different character. He's an entertainment lawyer who, quote, personifies the Gen X dogged disbelief in love. But we meet Skipper as he's working on his Gateway 2000 personal computer, which I can't tell exactly what model this is, but just like looking at it is bringing back a lot of memories of having this giant desktop computer and also going to those damn Gateway country stores with my mom. Anyway, classic 90s website design is on full display as things are happening on his monitor without him actually moving his mouse or clicking anything. But apparently we're on the DC Comics website and we're excited that Mad Magazine is relaunching, or has relaunched. I couldn't find any specific context for this, but I'm guessing it had to do with it becoming a monthly publication earlier in 1997. But anyway, we can see the cover for number 356, which was published for April 1997. Now, usually with like product placement, we have some kind of story, right, of like why characters are using certain things. I can't think of anything, and I doubt there's a story of why Skipper is on Gateway 2000. But it's not surprising that he's on the DC website, since HBO and DC Comics were both part of Time Warner at the time. Anywho, Skipper is a website creator, which explains the two computers. There's a computer behind him as we like meet him. And he's a hopeless romantic, which explains his stupid lines about love conquering all and the space for romance. Ugh. To be fair, though, when it comes to like completely changing Skipper's character, I don't think we could take someone as cynical as he is in the book seriously with that name. Like, imagine someone like Mr. Marvelous in episode 4 that we'll talk about, but like his name is Skipper instead of Jack. Like, okay, Skippy. Then just becomes an insult instead of condescending. Well, and condescending. Now, we come back to Peter and Capote getting beaten to the top of the wall by little kids. I love that little detail. And Peter is still deplorable and is still blaming women for the fact that men suck. But luckily, interspersed here is Miranda, who's, she's picking up her lunch earlier. Now she's got it. She's able to eat it. But she says what we should all tell ourselves every day. Why should I settle? Now, this line is actually spoken by Charlotte in the book. Then we go to Charlotte, who says nothing super useful. Then back to Peter and Capote. Now, what Peter said earlier and what he says now are actually said by Peter in the book, which is strange. But he tells us that women are always turning down, the short, fat, poor, ugly guys. But like, why is he yelling at us like he's incel? Like, that Peter is only hanging out with Capote Duncan so he can be attractive by association, and then like gets mad when women go home with Capote and not him. Right? Like, the only men who talk like this are the ones who are not getting laid. But once again, we have Miranda to the rescue. But first, in the book, Peter asks this question: why don't those women marry a fat guy? Why don't they marry a big tub of lard? So in the book, Candace Bushnell asks Charlotte that question, which is when we get Miranda's earlier response, albeit different. I'll tell you why. I've gone out with some of those guys, the ones who are short, fat, and ugly. It doesn't make any difference. They're just as unappreciative and self-centered as the good-looking ones. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about this fourth wall breaking and why it breaks my brain when Carrie does it. So to me, the reason that Peter, Capote, Miranda, Charlotte, and Skipper are speaking directly to the camera is because they're talking to Carrie, who's interviewing them for this article. Therefore, we're viewing them from her perspective, which is something I'll speak about way more in depth in a future retrospective. But then, like, what is going on when Carrie speaks directly to the camera? Like, okay, maybe she's just talking to herself. I guess that's possible, right? She's a New Yorker, very Woody Allen. Anyway, future me topic, we can move on. So now that we're done with this weird interview format, we finally get to see the girls all together for Miranda's birthday at Lucky Chang's at its original location in the East Village. Now, I can't tell you exactly who these queens were, but they are exactly what I think of when I think of like late 90s drag. If you've ever seen Billy's Hollywood Screen Kiss, you know exactly what I mean. Anywho, this is probably one of the most important scenes in the first season, if not the entire series, because it establishes one of the central tenets of the show, at least for a few seasons, which is, can women have sex like men? We finally get to meet Samantha Jones, who's obviously played by Kim Cattrall, the only person who could play this role. Which, fun fact, she almost didn't play this role. She was the obvious casting choice, but according to the True Hollywood Story, like I said, I'll talk about it once, her partner at the time, actor Daniel Benzali, didn't want her to take the role. So when she finally did, they called off their wedding and broke up. Now, she did also just have her own reservations about being on a series and like moving to New York. So she had to be talked into it by Dennis Erdman, who I don't have like enough information about. Dennis, he directed at least one episode of the show. Kim Cattrall described him as Darren Star's partner. And they have a lot of pictures together on the interwebs. So I'm thinking they were partners, are still partners. There's nothing to confirm it. Now, they did actually cast someone else in the role, but had to let her down as soon as Cattrall said yes. Now, in the book, Samantha is a movie producer and not a PR executive, but she's described exactly the same way Carrie describes her here, as a New York inspiration. However, most of Samantha's dialogue here is actually from Candace Bushnell, including the two choices as a successful single woman in the city. You can beat your head against the wall trying to find a relationship, or you can say screw it and just go out and have sex like a man. Also in the book, it's Carrie who slept with Drew and didn't feel a thing. Now, Samantha's line here about women having as much money and power as men, I'll get into during the retrospective. But the way that Miranda responds just like cracks me up. What she says here is actually said by Magda in the book. Yeah, Magda. Totally different character. Anyway, so Charlotte says the trick is getting the men to cooperate. Men in the city fail on both counts, said Magda. They don't want to have a relationship, but as soon as you only want them for sex, they don't like it. They can't just perform the way they're supposed to. Now, Miranda then relays a story from Book Charlotte about a nameless poet. In the show, he's named Jeremiah, who was great in bed, but then wanted to do the whole chat bit and read her his poetry, which was just not going to happen. Now, in the book, Charlotte here would have very much been like the odd person out. As a matter of fact, I doubt she would have even been invited. But that's where like show Carrie comes in and really helps her out by being the middle ground and keeping a level head in this conversation. She's the skeptical observer who forces Sam and Miranda to defend this choice, which helps us as an audience understand all viewpoints. Now, I do also want to quickly point out that I believe Samantha and Carrie are drinking Cosmopolitans, but they look more like frozen margaritas, so I'm not counting it yet. But I do love that, like, as we pan around to see all of the girls, that we instantly get a sense of who they are by their fashion choices. Samantha has a very low cut and revealing top. Charlotte looks all buttoned up and proper. Miranda looks like she could just kill someone in court. And then Carrie is kind of like a combination of all three women in her off-the-shoulder black top that reveals her bra. I feel like this will be one of the only times that all three women are actually in the same color. That's not a funeral. But this is like a really nice early indication of how these characters will dress to distinguish themselves further on in the series. Okay, so Samantha brings up the 1994 movie The Last Seduction, which stars Linda Fiorentino in probably her most acclaimed role as Bridget. Now, the movie itself is actually pretty fantastic, despite the very 90s saxophone score that we were apparently still trying to make sexy in 1998. However, the scene that Samantha and Miranda love so much is it's sexier in theory. Yeah. Uh, Bridget is in complete control in this scene, but and you can even see in the trailer that she's just like dead hanging and trying to like swing herself in to get things going. The movie itself is totally worth seeing. It's a really good movie. But the scene is like unintentionally hilarious, especially if you're watching it thinking of like Miranda and Samantha being like, oh yeah, get it. She's just like, anyway. I do love that Charlotte like hated the movie and Carrie really says nothing, which is especially funny because in the book it's Carrie who goes to see the movie and like thinks about this scene as the embodiment of the idea that women can have sex like men. But either way, it's like a nice touch that they included this detail in the show. So now in her mess of a bedroom, Carrie thinks more about this idea and is intrigued and wants to try to make this happen, right? Having sex like a man. Now, her bedroom and just her apartment in this episode, like, reminds me of the fonts that they use for the show. It's like, it's supposed to indicate that she's smart and we can take her seriously, but like, she's also quirky and fun to be around. So I'm glad that they at least changed her apartment, the interior, like after this pilot. So now we meet Stanford Blatch, Carrie's good friend who's also homosexual. He verbalizes Bushnell's theory that the only place you can find love and romance in New York is in the gay community, while straight love has become closeted. Now, it is such a clever line in the show, and I love that they included it, but I can't help but be like, what? And here's why. In the book, Bushnell actually gives us some context. So this is, quote, because of all I had read and heard recently about the multimillionaire who left his wife for a younger man and boldly squired this young swain around Manhattan's trendiest restaurants right in front of the gossip columnists. There, I thought, is a true lover. And she also points out her friend Parker and his partner Richard, who took care of Parker when he was sick, and Parker actually let him, right? Which is apparently something a straight man would never do. Now, Stanford in the show runs a talent agency and is down to a single client, Derek, something that we'll visit in episode 2. But Stanford is portrayed by the late Willie Garson, who also played Mozzie on White Collar. Now, I love Willie Garson in this role, but I have a few criticisms that I'll get to in a minute. Now, in the book, Stanford is still a good friend, but he's a screenwriter and has long, dark, curly hair. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about Stanford in the next episode. So let's, for now, move on to him spotting Kurt and like telling Carrie about it. He's like, I always hate this. Don't look now. I was like, well, now I have to look. Stop it. So Kurt Harrington is someone Carrie has slept with many times, and Stanford and she obviously loathe him because he's such a douchebag. This exchange between Carrie and Stanford, though, is probably like my favorite of this episode. You can just tell that they had fun filming this dialogue. But then Carrie just has to get up and prove to herself that she can have sex like a man and has no feelings for Kurt, which of course means that she has to go sleep with him. Now, this is where Willie Garson just like bugs me as a straight man playing a gay role. The way he says, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" is so stereotypical, like 90s gay character. But luckily, he does much better as the series progresses. Now, Kurt is played by Bill Sage, whose biggest role was probably as one of Patrick Bateman's skeezy coworkers in American Psycho, which also has Justin Theroux. He plays another coworker. But I know him as a very controversial coach in the Greg Araki film Mysterious Skin. He is like really sexy in that movie, which makes me question my life choices. Anyway, Carrie goes up to Kurt and she's like, "Hey, we're going to have sex, but we're not doing anything after that," which is obviously great news for him. So they meet at his place later, and like he's down there for her. And this is when she legit has sex like a man, right? Like she gets to finish and then says goodbye before he can. I do love that part. So she leaves, and this is where we meet Mr. Big outside of Kurt's building. Now, this meet cute isn't at all how they meet in the book, and it's honestly like kind of unnecessary if it wasn't for the conversation that they have later in this episode, which, because the dialogue is pulled almost verbatim from the book, is heavily reliant on this earlier meeting. They need to have met each other at some point before talking later on in the episode. But also, like, isn't it just way too convenient that they meet here in the street and meet again like a day later? Anyway, this dress is really cute, and SJP looks incredible in it. Those are some Manolos that she's wearing in this scene. Like, honestly, if she drops this line about Manolo Blahniks and Carrie's not in them in the entire episode, it's like, now we can't watch you for ever again. So anyway, Carrie meets up with Skipper, who says more absolutely corny things about his feelings and being a romantic. And then, for some reason, because he has feelings, surely he must be gay. God, the fucking 90s. Anyway, Carrie here proves what a horrible friend she is to both Miranda and Skipper and decides to set them up because why not? Now, Charlotte calls Carrie to tell her that she's going on a date with Capote Duncan and asks if she knows him. And Carrie's like, "Well, I know of him," even though she just did a full-on interview with him. And she proceeds to not tell Charlotte what a jerk he is. Anyway, next we find ourselves in Chaos, which I'm convinced they only went to because Chaos let them use the interior to shoot. It's like too bad that they weren't able to use Bowery Bar or something, you know, somewhere like that's actually in the book. And honestly, like this lighting is too bright to be called a club. I read somewhere that people refer to it more as the lounge, which makes more sense to me. Anyway, Miranda and Skipper have the exact conversation you would expect them to have, with Miranda dressed like she should be dropping him off at the club rather than enjoying herself on a Friday night. Like, yeah, that shirt's shiny, but like, take the suit off. Girl, it's Friday night. The only good thing I can say about this relationship between Miranda and Skipper is that it does thaw out Miranda for a little bit later on. Like, hi, curly brown hair and glasses. Okay. So Carrie runs into Kurt and has this like, "Oh, whoops" reaction to him actually wanting the sex like men arrangement. And I feel like this little scene here is why it's so important that Carrie is likable and relatable, right? Carrie in the book would never react this way in this kind of scenario. But she also becomes like an emotional wreck during her relationship with Big. So it really is important to the series that she has these conflicting feelings about having sex like a man, right? Like, honestly, if she were just indifferent in this scene, we would have two Samanthas. And I think one is more than enough in this friend group. Speaking of Samantha, she points out Mr. Big and describes him as the next Don, oh God, the next Donald Trump. Ugh. Uh, Except he's younger and much better looking, which just goes to show that everyone has always thought that that orange lump of a thing is ugly. Anyway, Mr. Big is portrayed by Chris Noth, who I really don't want to talk about because of his essay allegations. But I will say that this is probably the only episode where I find him even remotely attractive. Like, I'll be honest, I don't get and never have gotten the appeal, especially in later episodes, but like, sure, to each their own. Now, in the book, Mr. Big is pointed out to Carrie and is called a younger, better looking Ron Perlman. She's asked who it is, and she says, I know who it is, Mr. Big. By now, it's no secret that Mr. Big in the book was actually Ron Galletti, the one time Manhattan Hamptons Playboy and former publisher of Vogue and then Talk magazines. But here he's like some kind of financier or something. I think there was talk of insider trading at some point. I don't know. Anyway, he waves at Carrie. And she's like, oh, I've never seen him before in my life, which is like such an odd thing to say, considering that she'd just sized him up the day before, but whatever. Since Carrie doesn't know him, Sam is going to go hit on him because, duh, right? Just before she leaves, she sets up the premise for the next episode, saying he only dates models. Now, as she walks away, we really get to see Carrie's dress, and I feel like now is the time to say how glad I am that we never see this hair again, and that we don't see any dresses like this again, at least not until like CoverGirl, the CoverGirl episode. Now, the cut of this dress is amazing, right? SJP could look so sexy in this dress, but like not with that damn hair and not with that oh so 90s cardigan. There's just something that's off about this outfit, from like the cheetah print to her eyeshadow. It's just an unfortunate choice. Meanwhile, Charlotte looks almost amazing in this dress. Like, it's too bad that it doesn't actually fit right. Anyway, she and Capote Duncan are walking down the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, following what looks like the opening of the Indian court painting 16th to 19th century exhibition. He asks if she wants to go to his place to see his Ross Bleckner, and she initially declines, but then decides that she doesn't want to end the evening too abruptly, so she goes with him. Now, Ross Bleckner is an American artist who really rose to prominence during the 1980s, which is why it's such a big deal that Capote's painting was done in 1989. And I won't go too deep into his career, but in 1995, Ross Bleckner was the youngest artist to receive a mid-career retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum. So that's why Charlotte's like, ugh, Ross is so hot right now. Okay, so the rest of Capote's apartment, loft, whatever, like, hi, you know he's a bad person. Did anyone ever actually live like this? Like at Shay's Lounge, just off by itself, no rugs anywhere, an empty wall above the fireplace? Like, he's clearly a psycho. Anyway, he puts her into a cab, implies that they'll have a date on Saturday, which Charlotte tries to like make official. But then he gets his fuckboy ass into the cab next to her to go to chaos. Now, I don't like Charlotte as a character yet, but I am like so livid for her. But also, if Carrie had been honest with her, this would not have been a surprise. Okay. So now we come to Samantha hitting on Mr. Big in what is like one of the most painful scenes we've ever seen for Sam. It's so awkward. It's also obnoxious because, like, throughout the episode, we witness all of the women, like, essentially lose all of the power that they just worked up for themselves. Luckily, Miranda gets to kind of live her last seduction fantasy, but, like, what is up with those kisses? What? Oh, God. No wonder we think Miranda is a lesbian throughout this whole series. Now, Samantha goes home with fuckboy Capote Duncan, and amazingly enough, both she and Charlotte survive the visit to his apartment. Okay, that's all I'm saying. Now, Carrie wanders outside. She doesn't know how she's getting home, but she gets picked up by Mr. Big in his car. And they finally interact for the first time. Now, she says, oh my gosh, hold on. I'm shiny. She's shiny, y'all. I can't. Let's try to get that fixed up. So that's not too bad. Okay. Okay, that feels better. Okay. Now, she says to drop her off at East 72nd Street and 3rd Avenue, which would actually be really close to her fake address throughout the series, which is 245 East 73rd Street. Now, like, this is like a great little detail to me that survived for almost 30 years. But like I mentioned before, their conversation here in the car is pulled almost verbatim from the book. However, one major thing that I have to mention is that right after she nicknames him Mr. Big, she goes up to him and asks if he remembers her, to which he replies, abso-fucking-lutely. So we already got one abso-fucking-lutely in the book. Anyway, a few days later, they run into each other at Bowery Bar. And then that is where we get Mr. Big slid into the banquette next to her. Their sides were touching. Mr. Big said, so what have you been doing lately? Besides going out every night? Yeah, what do you do for work? This is my work. I'm researching a story for a friend of mine about women who have sex like men. You know, they have sex and afterwards they feel nothing. Mr. Big eyed her. But you're not like that, he said. Aren't you? She asked. Not a drop. Not even half a drop, he said. Carrie looked at Mr. Big. What's wrong with you? Oh, I get it, said Mr. Big. You've never been in love. Now, this interaction is much less cool and collected for Carrie in the show. But to me, like, this is where we fall in love with Carrie and the show. Because he drops her off, she gets out of the car, turns toward her building, and then stops. She then runs up, knocks on his window, and asks, have you ever been in love? And he responds, abso-fucking-lutely, and drives off. She then turns around and we freeze frame on her face. Her expression, difficult to read, but we don't need to know what's in her head because this is just the first episode, right? Now, a couple of things I wanted to point out since we're here. The first is where we drop off Carrie, which is outside of Clea Collet, which looks like it used to be a bridal gown designer and had a boutique that was on the second floor. We also see a Three Guys restaurant. Now, at first, I didn't see any antique stores next door, but there was one in at least as late as 2014, and it has the exact same awning as the one we saw at the beginning of the episode. Now, this Three Guys restaurant is still there at 960 Madison Avenue, which, if I'm doing the maths correctly, is not at all near East 72nd and 3rd. But they used at least 5 different exteriors for Carrie's fictional address. So it makes a lot of sense that the exteriors would be scattered throughout the city. Okay, so that is my breakdown of the pilot episode of Sex and the City. This is probably going to be the longest breakdown I'll do since we had to introduce a lot of characters and discuss a lot of themes that will affect the entire show. But I hope you enjoyed this. I had a lot of fun putting it together and doing some investigating of a city I've never lived in. So I hope you join me next week when we talk about Season 1, Episode 2, Models and Mortals. Until then, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.